just letting people come in and then I will start. So just one more minute. Okay, good afternoon and a warm welcome to this EPC 60-minute policy dialogue with Marco Buti. Welcome, Marco. Very good to have you here to discuss the economic governance review and the contribution we have tried to make from the EPC perspective. We have had a task force running where we've also engaged with you and some of the people you work with on rethinking EU economic governance. So we will be presenting a little bit also our results from that and hearing your reflections on that. With a thanks to Fondazione Cariplo who supported this. We carried that work out since June last year. And we've worked on 3 main work streams: the Stability and Growth Pact, the European Semester, and social investment, where we had 2 meetings for each one of those. And we have also published 3 policy briefs last year and then a final published publication this year in February, which contains a number of recommendations, and we will hear from some of the colleagues a bit later on as well. But I wanted to, before we start that, also have a very quick reflection on the current international context, the war in Ukraine, and the impact this might have on the economic governance review. And very happy then to also hear Marco's reflections on that. I think it's important before we go into any detail of that, that it is clear that we condemn the Russian war of aggression, which is aiming to change borders through military force. It is something we had hoped not to see anymore in Europe, but the reality is that this invasion has upended also the European stability framework in which we have operated. I think it's also important to commend the Ukrainians and to acknowledge the suffering which they are bearing the brunt of. It has been nothing short of remarkable how they have held up in this current situation. And of course, this will have a short-term impact. We are already seeing some of those impacts coming through the sanctions, through the energy and the commodities route. We are seeing the impact on prices. We're seeing impacts also on fiscal pressures. We're seeing many more demands on government spending for the future. It will have an impact on growth, on recovery, on many of the policy areas. And I think there we have to start thinking also beyond the short-term impact. There will be a much longer-term structural impact. And it will have to be a rethinking of European policies right across the board. That also means, of course, economic governance. Just to note, from my perspective, for example, it cannot be that the Recovery and Resilience Facility will remain a temporary instrument. We will have to have these kind of instruments on a permanent basis at the European level. We will have to talk about the fiscal deterioration which will come in member states. We will have to talk about how we find the money for the investments which are needed across the board, but particularly now in areas, for example, like defense, where enormous new amounts of investments will have to be found. We will have to talk about what that means also in terms of the impact on populations. How can we make sure that there is an equitable distribution of the inevitable costs which come with what is happening in the East and the response which is there. So from my perspective, I think what we will be spending the next month doing is revisiting all of our policy areas and rethinking everything we're doing to not only react to this, but to also put the right frameworks in place so that we can continue to deliver on the common objectives we have, including, for example, climate change. So it is a radically different environment in which we are. And I think what the last 2 weeks have already shown is that within that radically different environment, also there is a willingness now to break taboos of the past. And that is also something I think we need to consider within the economic governance framework. Are there things which might be possible now, which would not have been possible 2 weeks ago? So with those reflections, I'll hand over to Marco, who is of course now the head of cabinet of Commissioner Gentiloni, but also has had a distinguished career in the Commission beforehand. After that, we will also hear a little bit from my colleagues who worked on the economic governance review. And then I will open it up to the audience as a whole. If you do have a question, if you do have a comment to come in, then please put your electronic hand up and I will see that. But without further ado, Marco, very good to have you here. And I'm looking forward to hearing your reflections.
Thank you very much, Fabian. Thanks for the invitation to the EPC, to you personally, to your colleagues. I can have to say I can only concur actually word by word with what you said. Obviously, on all the solidarity and the admiration that we feel for the Ukrainian people. I mean, at this in this very, very difficult juncture, and so all our prayers and heart goes to them. I concur also with the spirit of your introduction in the second part, when you say that this shock will force us to think afresh across the areas for each individual policy and the interplay between the policies, what we do at the EU level, what we do at the national level. So the meaning of coordination, cooperation will have also to be revisited. We said after COVID, we have to build back better. That was what the president of the commission, my own commissioner, Commissioner Gentiloni, said so many times. Now, after this, which is a shock in rapid succession, actually we were still digesting the implications of COVID. Really, we need to build back anew and not only better. Now, maybe a way to, I was thinking, how to approach the issue now. I think, first of all, let me say one thing. This is clearly a systemic shock. I mean, we have gone through after 2008 the financial crisis, which in Europe took the form also of the sovereign debt crisis, existential in nature. Then the COVID crisis, a different one, but also extremely sharp and dangerous. And now we have this third crisis in a succession. So one has to, I think, revisit a bit the concept of normality. I mean, I'm saying something which is rather banal, if you like, but the idea that, okay, let's go through the night, through the storm, and wait for better times to rethink what we are doing. Actually, we cannot afford that. Maybe normality will never come back the way we used to think about. We know that making fundamental reforms during crisis, let's say, in a sense, has a political advantage and has, let's say, an economic disadvantage. I mean, the political advantage is the famous dictum by Jean Monnet that we react in crisis, and Europe in particular is the sum of the response given to these crises. So in a sense, when you are staring into the abyss, you know, we know it in our personal life also, you find the courage to do things that otherwise you would not consider. At the same time, and here the experience of the financial crisis, in a sense, is telling, but not fully instructive, is that to the extent that you know in crisis who are the losers and who are the winners, then it's not good to do structural reforms in those conditions, because it is clear that you know, the reforms will be done to the advantage of the winners and not of the losers. And that was a bit the experience during the financial crisis. And what I have said and written, actually more than once, is that one will have to recreate what Rawls called the veil of ignorance when you do the reforms. So you need to have, you do not need to know in advance who benefits from certain reforms. So it would mean that you take an approach which is more of an insurance type. Now, in the financial crisis, it was clear, and that was the division line between North and South, who were, you know, the winners, emphasizing responsibility, risk reduction, who were the losers, who emphasized solidarity and risk sharing. Now, I think with the COVID crisis, and also now with the Ukrainian crisis, I think we have recreated, in a sense, the veil of ignorance. So we are in a situation in which we can take a genuine approach to reform the EU, our policies, our coordination mechanisms, because in a sense, the winner or the lower losers of today are not necessarily the winners of the lower losers of tomorrow. So I think we can enter in an approach to solidarity, which is more of an actuarial, let's put it like that. And I think it was, I remember very vividly, I think a definition of solidarity by Junger Habermas, who emphasized precisely this. Solidarity, not a one-way street, not something that I give it to you because I'm generous, but something because I know that I help you out in this very moment. I create a condition to be helped when my turn comes later. So I think this is, in a sense, I think we should approach the reform of our coordination mechanism, our governance, taking this into account. Now, the shock that we are living, you mentioned it yourself, I think is a shock that is supply side in the first place, but working through confidence and other mechanisms is likely to become a shock also of the demand side. So in a sense, in terms of sequencing, it may be a bit the inverse of the COVID shock, which started as a demand shock, and then through the supply side bottlenecks, the interruption of the value chains became also a supply side shock. Here we have both elements. They may come actually in inverse order, but they are both, I think, sizable. Now, if you think about the Ukrainian invasion and the COVID crisis, there are some elements of similarities. If you look at, if you dissect it in economic terms. Now, both shocks are exogenous. And this, in a sense, is unlike the financial crisis. And what made the difference in COVID and vis-a-vis the financial crisis is that the typical moral hazard paradigm, which comes as a natural reflection when you have policy-induced shocks, does not apply. It did not apply to COVID, clearly. And we had Next Generation EU as a very important breakthrough, it does not apply in these cases here. So it is an exogenous shock, so moral hazard does not play any role. And I emphasize this. I say it because the moral hazard element casts a long shadow during the whole management of the financial and the sovereign debt crisis. So it's important to, it goes without saying, but it's important to emphasize nonetheless. The second element of commonality is a shock that is, in a sense, symmetric or external in origin, but asymmetric in outcome. So, and here the dimensions of asymmetry are essentially three. One is the financial links with Russia and Ukraine, which are differentiated between member states, clearly. The second is the exposure to energy energy imports from Russia. And the third is the refugee impact. So these elements here, all countries will be affected, but it is actually quite asymmetric between countries. In particular, the second and the third channel, so the channel of energy import and the channel of refugees, actually some countries may be, somewhat spared on both sides, and others are frontline on both sides. And then you have the combination in between. So, and this one, there are different groups of countries. So this element of calling also for solidarity, burden sharing, I think is important because of this asymmetric impact across the EU. The third element is the longer lasting nature of this. So I think we all hope this would be solved as quickly as possible, but it is clearly not a prudent assumptions to make. So one will have to work on the assumption that we are in for the longer run. And this is true also in case it happens that peace talks succeed, because I mean the shock waves will continue in the system even once we are over the immediate war emergencies. So I think as a policymakers, we'll have to, as I said many times, we'll have to lower up our discount rate and take a longer time perspective in all this. And the whole issue on which the Commission came with proposals on Repower EU, adopted on Tuesday in view of the European Council in Versailles, the informal meeting of the European Council, I think takes this structural perspective. So this is a bit what I wanted to say in the first place on the impact of the a way of looking. I think you have seen that I have not mentioned any number. We are working on that. I think that it is not prudent at this stage to venture into numbers. We are doing our model simulations as all international organizations. It's likely clearly that the shock is definitely sizable. Commissioner Gentiloni has indicated that it is sizable. It is not going to, let's say, break or call into question the current expansion. I think we were in a sense, the fundamentals of the rebound were actually pretty strong before this crisis here. So we will have to see clearly what the ramification that we will have. Now, what I would like to do now, if you allow me, is to show to share one slide where I have tried to do, to venture a bit into the unknown, in a sense. Please, I would like to ask you all and all those who are listening to us not to take this as let's say as position of the Commission, but it is my own personal reflection. So don't attribute it even to Commissioner Gentiloni or the Commission services. What I have done here in this slide is the only one I'm sharing. I hope you can see it. Can you confirm?
Yep.
Okay. So what I've done here is to identify, in a sense, the key issues that we put forward when we launched the review of fiscal policies. What we we looked at these issues back two crises ago, basically, in February 2020, and how I would see it now, post COVID-19, and in the context of the present crisis. So and you can see there, what I have done is I have indicated here with pluses the increase in importance due to COVID. That is the actually is the more okay. It's in the legenda. It says black, but it's actually, if I'm not mistaken, this is green. The green pluses is to COVID, and the red ones are due to the Ukraine invasion now. So how these elements increase the importance of the issues that we highlighted some time ago. And again, you can see pluses, a number of pluses. So it is a purely qualitative appreciation on my part. So the key issues at the beginning, I divided here in fiscal behavior and in governance. On the fiscal behavior is reining in the high public debts, dealing with the quality of public finances, ensuring a counter-cyclical fiscal stance. That's what we wanted from the from fiscal policy. And in terms of governance, there is the issue of simplification of the rules, enforcement, and what I call here the vertical coordination between the EU and national fiscal policy. So who does what and how we coordinate vertically. So the review at the time, I'm not going to go through all this. You can read it yourself in the slide. Indicated that, okay, on the high public debt, ensure a credible gradual reduction over time of the debt, quality of public finances. I mean, making sure that the quality of public finances are up to the challenge that we had. And at the time, even before the COVID crisis, the issue of the double transition and for public finances, particularly the green transition, was clearly had come to the fore. And on the counter-cyclical fiscal policy, here the issue is creating fiscal room in good times, allowing flexibility in bad times, and in particular, let me highlight the need to look also from a micro perspective and not only a macro perspective to fiscal stabilization, knowing that the different components have different multipliers and different effects. On the simplification, here I summarize what I've called, you have heard me maybe in the past also, the curse of the complete contract. And this is essentially related to the fact that in absence of trust between member states and institutions, the attempt was to actually draft the complete contract, trying to imagine all the possible state of the world where, in order to reduce discretion and in the application of the rules. But we know from theory and experience that complete contracts do not exist. They only make things much more complicated. So how to overcome this curse? And then on enforcement, greater ownership, strengthening the national fiscal frameworks, and the vertical coordination between EU and national fiscal policies, relying very much on the successful implementation of the RRF. This obviously was not in review of 2020, but came a bit later with Next Generation EU. So if you go through the third column here, Again, I mean, I'm looking at the pluses now. I mean, as we go through, we may decide maybe to add or to take out some of the signs here. Maybe it would be good to hear what you all think also. Clearly, there is a need to rein in public debt, given the increase in public debt and the need to have a credible debt anchor. Here, I think it seems to me quite evident that what is in the current fiscal rules, which is as a benchmark, the reduction of the debt from the level, from the current level to the 60% by at least 1/20 per year, seem to be far too ambitious to realize in practice. So this is one element in the discussion with the member states. I think this comes out as with quite widespread consensus. The quality of public finances, I think here this is important. It was important, post-COVID. RRF helps in this with the 20% and the 37% for digital and green transition, respectively. I think it's important even more now with the need to diversify energy sources. So I think post the present geopolitical crisis, I think it's important even more. On the counter-cyclicality of fiscal policy, here again, I have added two pluses in red because the reactiveness of fiscal policy, the need to stand ready to do what is needed, I think is clearly important. One has to consider clearly that we have supply shock, and we know supply shocks drive inflation and output in opposite directions, starting already with a high level of inflation. So the issue of targeted counter-cyclicality, I think, is important, probably even more than overall support in demand. I think simplification comes out more important, and the expenditure control as an important element. I think is, by the way, is one of the issues that in your report, several of these elements here, you find them in your report, your proposals also, Fabian. Then I think it's important also on the enforcement. Here, consider an RRF type of approach with the interplay between the Commission and the member states, I think is very promising. And finally, and I stop here, the issue of vertical coordination between EU and national fiscal policies. I think we have new EU public goods as being, and defense being one of them. So not only economic EU public goods, but also non-economic EU economic public goods come to the fore as a very, very, very important in the present juncture. So that's why I would think that those have dared here to add the two pluses on due to the current Russian-Ukrainian crisis. Let me end with just one reminder. On the 3rd of March, the Commission came forward with guidance for 2023 for fiscal policies, and we laid out a number of principles. But the main things to retain from that guidance is first of all, state contingency. So it is clear that the events will run the day, and we cannot commit at this moment. So reactiveness, agility is really the name of the game. This implies that the general escape clause, which is in force now, very helpful in 2022 to take all the measures that are needed. According to our forecast pre-crisis, we would have discontinued the general escape clause at the end of 2022. Now we'll have to see, and a decision will be made in May after the spring forecast. The second message is that we would not open excessive deficit procedures in spring. things will be reconsidered in autumn, and also given the nature of the guidance and the current situation, when we come to the European semester in May, our guidance will be essentially qualitative. So we are not going to venture into quantitative adjustment recommended to member states, but we remain on the qualitative side. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco, and also for bringing these interesting immediate thoughts to the table. It's great to have a chance to discuss that. Just to say, I've posted a link to one of our publications, which we actually did about a year ago, where we were talking about the age of permacrisis, so very much along the lines of what you've been discussing. And I think also the resonance of what you were saying on solidarity. We've called it enlightened self-interest, because in the end, it is a way of coming together and ensuring that we can deliver the objectives of the European Union. And this will be even more important in the current situation, because if we are not finding a way of showing that solidarity, the unity, which has been impressive, will be under threat if we have a very asymmetric impact, for example, of energy prices on different countries. So we're now turning to the report you've already kindly referred to, with three of my colleagues to come in for a short intervention. I have also asked them to give a bit of reflection on how the recommendations look like in the current context and what that might mean going forward. So I'm looking forward to hearing from all three of them. I will also post the link again for those who haven't seen it in the chat, so you can look at the full report. But at this stage, also wanted to say thank you very much to the three of you for all the hard work you've put into that and for producing such a high quality output in the end. So we'll start with Francesco De Angelis, then Laura, and then Federico, and then we'll go back to Marco for some reflections on that. So Francesco, please.
Thank you very much, Fabian, and thank you very much, Marco, for the opening remarks. When the Commission restarted the Economic Governance Review in October last year, nobody thought that in a few months' time we would have faced a war in Ukraine. And the current international situation, of course, as you said, Marco, will affect growth, inflation, and of course, there will be an impact on fiscal policy across the continent, because additional support will be needed to businesses particularly affected by the surge in energy prices. And of course, this situation will affect the timeline of the Economic Governance Review, most probably. A reform of the Stability Growth Pact, I think it's needed not only to address the current situation and the previous vulnerabilities of fiscal rules, but also because the attitude and the narrative on fiscal rules have changed throughout the years, and especially since the late 90s when the rules were first introduced. Now we know that fiscal policy is considered an important tool, a powerful tool for counter-cyclical purposes, and also to boost investments which are needed for the transition and for defense purposes, given the current situation. We have seen a strong fiscal reaction during the COVID-19 crisis, a perfect coordination with the monetary policy, which this was not the case actually during the global financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis. So we need a reform also because the current rules are not realistic. Especially if we consider the debt criterion. If we reinstate the current rules after the activation of the general escape clause, there will be a tendency to circumvent them, and so they will not be enforced, basically. So if there is no an agreement on new rules, in my opinion, it's better to have no rules, actually, to have a sort of semi-permanent or permanent generous escape clause, because the rules will not actually be enforced. I would like to say that, in my opinion, before diving into all the technical details of the rules, I think that member states, policymakers will need to understand, to find an agreement on what are the purposes of fiscal rules. And then from that, deciding what can be the best indicators and the best technical details. Because is it about investments? Is it about fiscal consolidation, exclusively fiscal consolidation? Is it about promoting reforms? So all of these policy objectives, of course, are meaningful, but I fear, and that's also what we said, what we wrote in our paper, we fear that actually there is a risk of overburdening the Stability and Growth Pact. And it is important to link the Stability and Growth Pact with all the other aspects of the economic governance. So the European semesters, and of course, linking the SGP also with other potential new instruments. We have established new instruments during the COVID-19 crisis, and we have to understand what lessons can be learned from these new instruments. So the SURE instrument and the RRF. I would like to conclude my first reaction by asking a question. As you said, Marco, is important to strike a balance between clear enforcement, transparency, and of course flexibility. But this is a difficult balance to strike, because when the rules at the end of the 90s were first introduced, they were actually clear, but we discovered that nobody wanted to implement them, and in 2005 we got to the first reform of the Stability and Growth Pact. So how do you see possible to strike a balance between basically flexibility and clarity and a stronger enforcement? Because I fear that it's a trade-off and a difficult balance to strike. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Now going over to Laura Rayner.
Thanks, Fabian, and thank you, Marco. I'd just like to pick up on a couple of points. Within the task force that I was navigating, we were looking at the topic of social investment in particular, and considering how the rules have limited investment over the past decade, and not just in those member states with excessive deficits, but also generally across the board. And also we were looking at how future rules could correct this, which indeed they must, not merely in order to meet the ambitions of the green and digital transitions, but actually also because nearly all gross investment has been replacement investment, and basically merely maintenance rather than any future-oriented investment spending. So this is clearly unsustainable indefinitely. One point that was raised in the sense that social investments, whether that's in education or childcare, social housing, have in some member states, or at least until the pandemic, been sometimes portrayed as luxuries which governments can't afford. Now, while this has been shown to be false, I mean, even if you leave aside the economic benefits of these investments, which are quite clear, the other benefits in terms of social cohesion are quite clear, and certainly in terms of Fabian's point on reflecting on the situation of in Ukraine, I would also point out that the value in strengthening societal resilience is huge. So what we felt in the task force would be a useful step would be a reassessment of the public accounting treatment of public or social investments to account for the return on different types of social investment. And this could encourage reassessment at member state level of the definitions of public investments versus current public spending, which would, one hopes, improve the quality of public finances overall. Now, while I recognize that any sort of golden rule has its challenges politically. But if I would suggest that if there's a sort of widely accepted definition, which you could then use to assess how public finances have been allocated, it would certainly provide a more concrete foundation for any sorts of these discussions, whether that's related to green investment or any other form of investment. A further point that has already been mentioned by my colleague Francesco in relation to the SGP, this persistent concern of overburdening. But I would raise my eyebrows a little bit at this quite regular call to not overburden the European semester in particular. While it seems that there's this fear that overburdening actually is referring to including social objectives within the semester, potentially environmental objectives in the semester as well, I would argue that actually, unless all of these things are put in one place, then there's never going to be any simplification, that actually we do need to use the semester as the tool to bring everything together, to have one central overview where we can actually look at the trade-offs, discuss the trade-offs between the European institutions and the member states. So actually the semester going forward has an even bigger role to play than perhaps has been the case so far. And just finally, to touch on the Versailles summit, and hopefully you've got your crystal ball there, you can have a look into. But initially, when the summit was planned, many months ago, the intention was for it to discuss a potential new European growth model. Yeah, clearly Ukraine and the consequences of the invasion will now dominate. However, the Commission up till now has been quite outspoken on the need to shift away from a solely growth at all costs economic model, which has been structured, of course, around the European Green Deal. And this summit should have been a good opportunity to look at some of the questions around this, especially in the context of the economic governance review. Yeah, as I said, although Ukraine has clearly shifted the playing field somewhat, the need to move to a more sustainable economy remains. The need to realize the ambitions of the Green Deal remain. So I would just be very interested to get your insights as to where you feel this discussion sits now in the context of our new dynamics.
Thanks very much, Laura. And last but not least, Federico Mollet.
Thank you very much, Fabian, and thank you very much, Marco, for your presentation. It was deeply insightful and very, very useful. And thank you for the reference to our paper, which I would encourage all the audience to go out and read. I think there's quite a strong alignment between a lot of our proposals there, a strong complementarity with the issues that you highlighted in your slide, particularly around the role of the RRF, or rather RRF-style governance, as a way to drastically improve how the European semester and the SGP operate. We definitely see that there is a strong role for that kind of governance mechanism, multi-year, with strong national plans, with milestones, with targets, as a way to improve coordination and governance across the EU. Both to improve the composition of fiscal spending, but also to try and improve the aspect of vertical coordination between EU and national objectives. And last but not least, to provide a kind of strong governance system and institutional mechanisms that can help mitigate some of the concerns that are felt in some quarters around greater flexibility in the SGP, which my colleague Francesco referred to. We did see that as a very important part of our work and critical to debate going forward, that concerns amongst, I suppose you would call them more hawkish member states, that extra flexibility, while macroeconomically justified and justified under solidarity, could just be misspent and need to be mitigated. And the RRF mechanisms do potentially serve as a way to address some of those concerns. But I really wanted to ask about the interaction between not just the fiscal framework, but also the monetary framework and some of the new pressures that we're seeing. You talk a lot about the need for greater solidarity in the Union, particularly as we're seeing asymmetric shocks. And as we're seeing now with Ukraine, the consequences of which are still to be determined. But over the past 10 years or so, the EU has kind of operated under a policy equilibrium where low inflation and low interest rates and the accommodative ECB actions to try and respond to that have also supported the balance sheets of more fragile member states. But now we find ourselves in a situation where not only do we have the sort of huge investment needs for the green digital transition, which are kind of epoch defining, but now we have this exacerbated by the shock of the invasion of Ukraine, with its knock-on impacts on energy markets, commodity markets, and supply chains ranging from semiconductor to wheat, all of which are placing even greater inflationary pressures, which may persist for some time, and will place an even greater burden on the ECB to start to roll back some of its more accommodative measures, which will potentially start placing pressures on spreads between member states and leading again to the fiscal fragmentation that we've seen. So I'd like your view on what can kind of be done to address this, and the role potentially of a more central investment capacity to shoulder some of these burdens for what is essentially investment for the EU public good, to try and address this conundrum. And if not, then what other mechanisms are there to try and make sure that the ECB's inflation fighting mandate, does not start to contradict with its attempts to keep avoid financial and fiscal fragmentation in the Eurozone. Thank you.
Thanks to all my colleagues. I can't resist as a German to also follow up on the last one, to just say maybe this is also the time when we have to think in Europe about living with a higher degree of inflation than we're used to. But that, I think, is something which, of course, will be very controversial, particularly in countries like Germany. But thanks to all my colleagues for those contributions and for all the hard work which has gone into the report. And I have posted the link so people can also look that up. Just a reminder that if you want to come in, either put up your hands or you can also write your question in the question and answer section. And we will have a little moment maybe to take one question at the end. So first come, first served. But first I'll give Marco a possibility to also respond to my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Fabian. Thank you all, Federico, Laura, and Francesco, for your suggestions. I have to say that your report is very good. So, I mean, what you put forward, what has been distributed by Fabian now actually contains, in a sense, addresses. If you go back to my slide before, addresses basically all those the points that I make there. And I have to say, on a personal basis, I very largely concur with your approach, both on the goals, the approach to reform, but also on the means, on the instruments, etc. Now, let me take then some of your observations. The first one is on the timeline. Okay, should this lead to postponement in the reform of the governance? Now, okay, if one says, okay, let's wait for better times, we go back to what we said at the very beginning. Better times may never come back. At least they may not in a sense of normality, of a new steady state that would then allow to take things calmly and decide in a leisurely manner. So that is in a sense an immediate, rather straightforward, banal reply. But the second point, I think it is more important, is the endogeneity. I mean, we will have to reconsider the role of public finances at the national level, on the EU level, the horizontal coordination between fiscal policies at the national level, between fiscal policies at the national and the EU level, and also of fiscal and monetary policies, in a way to come out stronger from the present crisis. So this, in a sense, there should be seen as means in order to address the shock. So also from this more substantive viewpoint, I don't think that we should postpone. Now, I understand very well that if we think about, let's say, a pie of political capital, you know that this is, tend to be limited. So either you devote it to one thing or to another thing, and now all the political capital and attention goes to how to deal with the emergencies in following the Ukraine-Russia crisis. But I think beyond that, so if you may have some possible impact on the timeline, but I would not see this as actually postponing what we were thinking about. So for us, the idea in terms of process was, okay, we relaunched the public consultation till the end of the year. We have come out with this guidance at the beginning of March, and the idea would be that, let's say June, summer, early summer, to come forward with orientations on how to address the governance review issues and the reform. This does not mean an immediate proposal for legislative changes, but indication from the Commission where we see the landing zone. And then subsequently, and exactly when we will have to see, then to come forward with the legislative changes that are needed and as needed. So this is the first thing. So I would not see that the present crisis, in a sense, displaces the issue. And I have to say, I would be wary of entering into a permanent state of the exception from the rules, in which the general escape clause continues to apply indefinitely. I think I say this, and that is something that you may have as a concern from the northern side of Europe, but actually, from my viewpoint, I see it more from the more vulnerable high debt countries. So for in the present dangerous times in which you will have to devise extraordinary measures which will have inevitably an impact on the public finances. Let's see for how much that will be. It will depends on many variables. Not in a situation in which you will face a trade-off of a stagflationary type, so with pushing up inflation and depressing growth, and this clearly is not going to be favorable for the public finances. So for countries facing sustainability issues, I mean, conducting their public finance management without any corridor, let's put it like that, within which to actually devise their strategies, which would reassure the markets, I think it's actually not something that it would be favorable for them. So I think there is, from different perspectives, northern type more attached to fiscal discipline, and the southern type being, fending off risk of sustainability. I think having in place a new set of rules which would be adequate to the present moment would, I think, be the right thing to do. Now, several of you have mentioned the RRF as I think as a new, in a sense, coordination system. I think this has been pretty remarkable. If I take the adoption of Next Generation EU, but also then the implementation, we have had 22 national plans submitted to the Commission, adopted by the Commission, and then adopted by the Council. And I have to confess that when the plans were presented in close interactions with the Commission, and the Commission proposed to the Council what is called in the RRF regulation the Council implementing decision, I thought and feared that the usual dynamics of delay, taking hostage, postponing, and things would take place in the council, in the various committees, also a bit for posturing reasons for the usual dynamics. This has not taken place. And actually, both the adoption of the plans, the disbursement of the 13% pre-financing back in summer and early autumn, and the adoption of the first payments has actually gone through very smoothly. And what I think has been recognized there on the part of the member states in the council and in the committees is that the Commission has engaged very strongly with the member states even before they presented the programs, to make sure that they presented good programs. And the council implementing decision is proposed by the Commission. So it's not each member state going with a plan to the council trying to convince the colleagues there. It has to be the Commission through the council implementing decision with a proposal on that has to go there and defend the plan of the country. So this, I think, has worked, I would say, reasonably well, and it has helped to recreate a climate of trust, which I think would be very favorable if it is also, this kind of trust also placed into the discussions on the reforms of the governance, and this interplay between a strong ownership by countries with the plans, blessing by the Commission, Commission helping the countries to go the extra mile on the reforms, on the investment, I think is something that we can use also in the governance, because it is very clear that it is what is key for enforcement, and this has been one of the problems we have been facing in the past, is the lack of ownership. Stronger ownership helps stronger enforcement. So looking again at the rules in terms of a gradual path of reduction of the debt, an instrument that is controllable, as in your report, I think emphasis on expenditure, I think, is important there, and I think more transparent, more controllable, more under the control of the government. But then clearly, once the member states are fully behind in a more differentiated way to take into account the point of departure, a certain path for the public finances, I think then you would be in the position, and it would be the responsibility of the Commission, of the Council, to actually then enforce credibly the new rules. So this is a bit the general trade-off. Rules which are, let's say, in a sense, nominally more reasonable, especially on the, let's say, 120th, which have a commitment, I think, on the quality of public finances also, but then those rules then are also being more enforceable and enforced eventually. So that, I think, is the element of, is where I think the direction we should go. On the Versailles, I mean, taking place right now, the idea was indeed to these 2 days, the leaders deciding on major EU priorities, and then decide how to finance this, how to deliver this at the national EU level. I think, okay, the present crisis has disrupted that plan there, but up to a point, because indeed, I'm sure they are going to discuss issues like defense, how to approach in the present crisis, the energy policy, and these are EU priorities, which then will have to be translated in terms of what to do at the EU and at the national level. So I'm talking, and I have written this. I mean, I did a little box paper a couple of weeks ago, also before the Ukraine invasion on EU public goods. And there, I think there is an issue of EU pure public goods delivered and financed at the European level. In your proposal, you have a central fiscal capacity along these lines. But then you have also the interplay between, let's say, EU goods delivered at the EU level, financed at the national level, and vice versa. Something that is can be done, financed at the EU level, and in terms of implementation done at the national level. A central fiscal capacity is, I think, important also to ensure that balanced monetary fiscal policy mix. That's something that in the public consultation, the IMF, the ECB, the OECD have proposed, actually, so the international organizations, they have all behind that in different ways. One more for the green transition, others more as as a stabilization tool to go hand in hand with monetary policy. What is clearly key here is the success of the RRF and Next Generation EU. So if we really show also to the more frugal countries, which by the way have undergone a bit of genetic mutation as well in the present crisis, you show that you are successful on the Next Generation EU. I think one creates the conditions to discuss a central fiscal capacity in a more let's say promising environment. On inflation and monetary policy, let me finish on this. Okay, first of all, I think the experience on Next Generation EU is a very important one, also from the point of view of avoiding financial fragmentation. One of the problems that we had during the financial crisis was indeed until the famous whatever it takes and QE by the ECB, the financial fragmentation across within the Eurozone. The fact that leaders and so member states were able to decide on Next Generation EU, showing then a strong determination and unity in dealing with the COVID crisis, this helped reducing the financial fragmentation in the first place, even before any money, any euro would actually be transferred to the member states. So I think this is important that it continues now. And on inflation, okay, we have, I think I borrow Fabio Panetta's classification, good, bad, and ugly inflation. We have, given the recovery so far, good inflation, so coming from the demand side. We had quite a lot, even more now, of ugly inflation that coming from the supply side. But what is very important is that we do not end up with ugly inflation. So good inflation, good. Bad inflation, you have to be able to look through to the extent that it comes from supply shocks, and then you have to avoid the ugly inflation of a self-fulfilling prophecy, in which the inflation expectations have become de-anchored. And I think in the present crisis, I think one has to make the distinction, I think, between jump in the price level and actual inflation. What is volatility? I think the ECB will be, I think, very wise in making sure that the present circumstances are taken into account, and the present supply shock, but also the forthcoming demand shock, do not lead to a policy stance which may be self-defeating eventually.
Thank you very much. That has been a fascinating discussion. I know I've gone a little bit over time, but I didn't want to stop it there. And I'm sure we will also return to many of these issues in the coming month. Thank you very much, Marco, for engaging with the report and coming today to discuss this with us. That has been really helpful. And I'm looking forward to continuing that discussion. Thank you also to my colleagues who have worked on that report and have produced the high quality which you have also recognized. And thank you to the audience for listening to this discussion. And I hope we will engage with you very soon again, and maybe even in person at some point in time. That would be very nice.
And hopefully in more auspicious times.
Indeed. Thanks.